Good morning. It's Sunday, May 28th. And as usual, when I started looking for something to talk about, I found something that was very unpleasant. But that's what's going on all around this country, so this didn't surprise me all that much. But the numbers were astounding. I'm talking about Medicaid. From the start of the pandemic until very recently, this April as a matter of fact, many people were left on Medicaid. There was nobody being removed from Medicaid for any reason because of the pandemic and everybody was getting assistance. And do you know how many people in this country are on Medicaid? 90 million people are on Medicaid. Now, Medicaid has a bunch of rules and regulations, but most of it is based upon your income level. So, if we have 90 million people at the income level that allows them to be on Medicaid, that's a pretty sad statistic. Because Medicaid is not looking at people who are making the average income. It's below average income, probably somewhere in the low 20s, right? So in any event, people are now being removed from Medicaid. And the states are doing this systematically, and the federal government has really nothing to do with the states removing people, even though the states do get money from the federal government to sponsor the Medicaid. But it's a combination affair. States contribute and the federal government contributes to the costs of Medicaid. And the early results of watching this fiasco take place indicate that many people have lost their coverage for procedural reasons, not for income reasons. For instance, if somebody did not return their paperwork to verify their eligibility or could not be located, they're taken off Medicaid. And a large number of these terminations on procedural ground indicates that many people may be losing their coverage because they're still qualified for it, even though they're still qualified for it. And many of those who have been dropped from Medicaid have been children. So it's a terrible situation. Now, as I said before, until the pandemic was declared over in the spring, states were not allowed to remove people off Medicaid. That was a provision that was put into effect as part of the coronavirus relief package that was passed by Congress in 2020. But it's over. The pandemic has been declared over, and so these people who are on Medicaid, and this runs the gamut in the age group, so there are many who are very young and have fallen victim to this being displaced from Medicaid, and then there are already elderly who maybe are not capable of catching up with whatever's happening. But we're looking at some members of our society that really need help, and they are being barred or removed by their states from coverage. So Medicaid coverage ended in March, and now the states are releasing the data on what's been happening to those people who lost their coverage. And this is a first glimpse at the punishing toll that has been taken on the so-called unwinding of the poorest and most vulnerable Americans. That's right, it's the poorest and the most vulnerable who are getting hurt by the removal, obviously, from Medicaid. And so far, 19 states have started to move people from the roll. And there's no precise total right now of how many people have been lost yet. But let's look at Arkansas, for instance. Arkansas had more than 1.1 million people. That's over one-third of the state's residents who were on Medicaid at the end of March. In April, 73,000 of those people lost their coverage, and that included 27,000 children ages 17 and under. That's a disgrace. That's a big rush. That just proves that the governors Huckabee Sanders in March just doesn't give a shit about her people. It's just in there rushing to save money as fast as they could and screw those poor Arkansas residents who are among the poorest in the nation. And here's a kicker. They cite a nurse who does wonderful things for people, lost her coverage because she makes $35,000 a year. She got a raise, and that costs her coverage. And she's not the only one. Over 5,000 people who received a raise in Arkansas lost their coverage because they got that raise. That's ridiculous. But you know what? I'm not surprised that this kind of stuff is happening because this is a typical U.S. screw-up. They go ahead and they do this thing without understanding what the consequences are going to be. Did anybody do any research before they cut loose in April? No. They should have taken a look at this thing and said, before we cut loose, we got to make some adjustments because a lot has happened in the last 3 years, and we're going to cut people off under the old rules and regulations, and that's not right. There's been changes in the way we live in those last 3 years, and there have been changes in the cost of living and everything. So here you are throwing people off Medicaid, and when they go out, because they got a minuscule raise that put them over the limit, and then they go out and they blow that whole raise because now they got to purchase health care that's a lot more expensive. And then you got a group of people who are running around this country telling people that universal health care is a form of socialism, and we don't want to be a socialist nation. We got to be a capitalist nation. And we got to screw 90 million people on a regular basis, right? All of that nonsense, because when we do something, we don't think about the consequences. As was shown when we started dishing out money at the beginning of the pandemic. And people were getting that money, and $60 billion of it was lost in frauds. This exercise with stopping Medicaid is the same kind of exercise, poorly executed. We didn't think exactly what was going to happen, but we should have recognized the fact that there are a lot of vulnerable people. 90 million vulnerable people we affect, right? And how much is that? That's 25% of the population. That's not very good. Not very good. And these people vote also. So who's going to get the shit kicked out of them at the election booth if anybody remembers the Medicaid fiasco? Another example of our poor planning and our poor execution. And it's a shame because we have damaged the most vulnerable segment of our society. Think about that. Think about how bad that is. So I leave you with that this morning. Have a great day. Bye.